Coordination and Response in Humans, Form 5 Biology. Learning objectives. Students should understand how organisms are able to respond to changes in their environment. They should understand that a coordinated response requires a stimulus, a receptor and an effector. They should describe how nervous system controls responses. They should understand the central nervous system consists of brain and spinal cord and is linked to sense organs by nerves. Students should be able to understand that stimulation of receptors in the sense organs sends electrical impulses along nerves into and out of the central nervous system. They should understand the role of neurotransmitters. They should describe the structure and functioning of simple reflex arc illustrated by the withdrawal of a finger from a hot object. They should describe the structure and function of the eye as a receptor, and finally they should be able to understand the function of the eye in focusing on near and distant objects and in responding to changes in light intensity. Let's have a quick look on these two situations given in these particular pictures. As per the image on my left hand side, suppose you accidentally touch a hot kettle without knowing, and what would be your response? You will immediately feel the heat and you will take away your hand from that burning object. Whereas in the second situation, if you smell one of your favorite foods and it will be mouth-watering, and you will quickly reach that particular food and you will eat it. Similarly, in order for living organisms to find food, avoid danger, find a mate, basically everything they do to live, they could have been able to respond to their surrounding or any changes in their surrounding. So, stimulus is basically a change in one's internal or external surrounding which leads to a certain response. The surroundings outside the body are called the external environment, and the inside of the body is known as the internal environment. Keep in mind that our body responds to changes in its internal environment, such as temperature and blood glucose levels. So, stimulus can be considered as a signal that you get. Organisms need to be able to detect these stimuli and respond to them very effectively. A receptor is capable of detecting a stimulus. Receptors detect a stimulus and send an electrical impulse down neurons to the central nervous system. Neurons are nerve cells. So, here the central nervous system acts as the coordination center. The coordination center sends electrical impulses down other neurons to the effectors, and the effectors bring about a response. Effectors are usually a muscle which can contract or a gland which can secrete a hormone. Let's refer the given example in this slide. Imagine a situation where you are hungry and you smell food. So the stimulus is the smell of the food. Receptor is your nose. Brain is the coordination center which is responsible for the secretion of saliva from the salivary glands as the final response. Receptors. Receptors help to detect the stimulus by changing its energy into the electrical energy of the nerve impulse. For example, human eye converts the light energy into a nerve impulse. Ear converts sound to a nerve impulse. So, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin are the basic receptors in human body. Now, a key part of this coordinating system is the nervous system. It consists of two parts. We've got the central nervous system or CNS, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then we've got the other nerves running to and from the central nervous system. It is known as the peripheral nervous system. It includes 31 pairs of nerves that branches from the spinal cord, which are known as spinal nerves, and 12 pairs that emerge from the brain, which are known as cranial nerves. Collectively, these 43 nerve pairs are considered as the peripheral nerve system. Let's look at the structural components of a typical neuron. The neuron is a very fascinating portion of the nervous system, which is also known as the nerve cell. The structure of the neuron offers key features to help it transmit messages across relatively long distances. So to begin with, it has a cell body which houses cell's nucleus. The cell body has fine cytoplasmic extensions called dendrons. These dendrons in turn form tree-like branches called dendrites. These are used by neurons to detect both chemical and electrical stimuli. One of the extensions from the cell body is much longer than the other dendrons. It is the fiber that carries impulses to the effector organ, and it's known as the axon. It serves as the primary communication pipeline from one end of the neuron to the other. The axon is covered by a sheath of myelin, which is a fatty material, and this sheath of myelin insulates the axon, preventing short circuits within other axons and protect the whole neuron. And also it speeds up signal conduction. The gaps between the myelin sheaths are called as nodes of Ranvier. These also aid in signal conduction and also allow nutrients and waste to enter and leave the axon. Finally, at the end of the neuron, there are extensions that branch off from several axon terminals. Message transmission happens in a particular direction from one side of the cell body towards the axon terminal. Now we will take a look at different types of neurons. There are three main types of neurons according to their functions. First one is sensory neuron. Second one is motor neuron. Third one is relay neuron. We will start from sensory neurons. These are the nerve cells that are activated by sensory input from the environment. For example, we take information from the receptors in the skin. It could be touch receptors, heat receptors, pain receptors. So, the information taken inside from these receptors has to transfer to the central nervous system. There are these other neurons called motor neurons which transmits impulses to the muscles or glands. There should be connections between sensory neurons and motor neurons. So, these types of neurons are called interneurons or relay neurons. When you touch a hot object, sensory neurons in your fingertips convey the information to the central nervous system. Then it will be taken from an interneuron and passes to another interneuron, or it can be passed to a motor neuron directly. So the motor neuron can convey commands to your muscles in the hand to take an action by taking away your hand because it's a hot object. So here you can see the three different types of neurons. Synapse. There are tiny microscopic gaps between two nerve cells called synapses. When it gets to an end of one neuron, the electrical impulse stops. This causes the ends of the fine branches of the axon to secrete a chemical called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitter chemicals diffuse across the gap and bind to the receptors on the membrane of the second neuron. This triggers the next impulse to continue its signal. So, synapses is considered as a junction between two neurons. And when we talk about the central nervous system, it's made of many billions of nerve cells, and these cells have links with many other through synapses. Lots of responses are coordinated by the brain. Let's say you want to pick your favorite storybook and read. This action is a voluntary response, which is something you have decided to do. But there are some things that you don't have to think about. You want them to happen automatically. We call these actions reflexes. It doesn't involve your brain to coordinate the response. So the response is usually quicker than a normal nervous response. As these actions are automatic and rapid, these responses will prevent you from injuries and hopefully will keep you alive. The nerve pathway of a reflex action is called the reflex arc. So let's look at an example. What will happen if you touch a hot object? The stimulus is heat and the receptor is the pain receptor in the skin. So the stimulus is detected by the pain receptors of the skin, and the electrical impulses now passes from the receptor along the sensory nerves to the central nervous system. In this case, it's the spinal cord. Afferent neuron is also known as the sensory neuron. Remember that these sensory neurons are connected to receptors, and receptors allow us to sense our environment. At the end of the sensory neuron, there is a synapse. At the synapse, a neurotransmitter is released and this chemical is diffused across the membrane to a relay neuron in the central nervous system, where it triggers an electrical impulse. The electrical impulse now passes across the relay neuron and reaches another synapse. Once again, the neurotransmitters triggers an electrical impulse in a motor neuron, like here. The triggered impulse now passes down the motor neuron to an effector. The pathway is indicated in the blue line. In this instance, the effector is a muscle. The muscle now contracts and pulls the hand away from the heat. So, that's the ultimate response. Even though in most cases, the brain actually makes decisions about what we do, in the case of reflexes, there is no decision making by conscious part of the brain. This makes reflexes automatic and rapid. So, they help us to protect ourselves from any dangerous situation. In the second picture here, you can see a knee-jerk reflex. It is a well-known reflex which allows us to maintain posture and balance. When a doctor taps the tendon just below your kneecap with a small hammer, it causes our lower leg to automatically kick outward. It's a reflex which occurs throughout a part of the spinal cord without the involvement of the brain. Now in this section we are going to discuss how a nerve impulse is transmitted. A nerve impulse is an electrical signal that travels along the axon of a nerve cell. The membrane of a neuron contains thousands of gated channels. These channels allow sodium ions or potassium ions to pass through the membrane. Generally, these channels are closed before a nerve impulse is transmitted, and the membrane is said to be in a resting state. In the graph given here, the first part indicates the resting potential. When considering the first diagram in the right side, sodium ions are represented in yellow color circles and potassium ions are represented in orange color circles. You can clearly see the number of sodium ions outside the membrane are higher than the number of potassium ions inside the membrane. So initially the potential of the inside of the membrane is nearly negative 70 millivolts. In this situation, the cell membrane of a neuron is said to be polarized because of this electrical difference across the membrane. So, now when a nerve impulse starts or when a sensory input disturbs the resting stage of the plasma membrane of the nerve cell to a point that the potential difference reaches a threshold voltage of negative 55 millivolts as indicated here. This causes many sodium ions channels to open briefly. It allows positively charged sodium ions to flow inside the cell membrane. Then the inside of the membrane temporarily becomes more positive than the outside of the membrane. This situation causes the voltage to rise. So this is known as the depolarization stage. The membrane is said to be depolarized because the net charge inside the axon changed from negative to positive as sodium ions flow in. As the impulse passes, the potassium channels begins to open, allowing positively charged potassium ions to flow out, which causes the inside of the axon to resume a net negative charge. At this point, the voltage would fall. The membrane is now said to be repolarized. The membrane is negatively charged in the inside and positively charged on the outside. This sudden switch in voltage is called as the action potential. It only lasts for a very few milliseconds. A nerve impulse is propagated and it is known as a propagated action potential. After a nerve impulse, some voltage gated potassium channels remain open, resulting in further movement of potassium ions out of the cell. As the voltage continues to fall below the resting stage, like this, the membrane is said to be hyperpolarized, as the inside of the membrane has become more negative than the beginning. Somehow, again, the ion exchange pumps in the membrane sort out the imbalances of sodium ions and potassium ions and returns the neuron to its resting stage as given here in the last part of the graph. Remember, the nerve cells are also called as excitable cells as they can exchange their membrane potential in this way. Now we'll be discussing about the human eye in detail as a sense organ. Let's start by looking at the functions of different parts of the eye. Light rays pass through the transparent front of the eye. This is called the cornea. The job of the cornea is to start the focusing of the light rays. The light rays then passes through the pupil in the center of the iris. The iris is the colored part of the eye. The light rays now passes through the lens. The function of the lens is to focus the light rays onto the back of the eye. One key feature of the lens that it can change its shape, allowing us to focus on distant or near objects. The light rays are focused onto the back of the eye to a special place. It is called the retina. Retina is the innermost layer of the back of the eye. It's a light sensitive layer where light energy is converted into the electrical energy of nerve impulses. The retina contains receptor cells called rods and cones. These cells react to light, producing impulses in sensory neurons. The sensory neurons then pass the impulses to the brain through the optic nerve. So here is the optic nerve. Rod cells work well in dim light, but they are not capable of distinguishing between colors. So the brain basically gets an image produced by the rods in black and white. That's the reason why we can't see colors in dim light. The cone cells will work only in bright light. We can see all the colors of the visible light as the cones respond to the wavelengths of red, green and blue in the visible spectrum. Cone cells are found in all over the retina, but it's particularly concentrated at the center of the retina, and that area is called the fovea. Remember, cone cells always gives a sharper image than rod cells. The white part of the eye is called the sclera. Here is the sclera. This tough outer structure protects the eye. The ciliary muscles and suspensory ligaments work with the lens. So here are the ciliary muscles and here are the suspensory ligaments. Together, they allow to focus on distant or near objects. The pupil is the space in the center of the iris. Here is the pupil. The light passes through the pupil. The job of the iris is to control the size of the pupil. Underneath the sclera, there is a dark layer called choroid. It has many pigment cells and blood vessels. These pigment cells stop light being reflected around inside the eye. Now let's talk how the human eye forms an image. To form an image on the retina, light from an object needs to be bent or refracted. Refraction of light takes place when light passes from one medium to another, where there are differences in the densities. Then the light passes through the iris and the pupil. As a result of refraction from the cornea and lens, an image is constructed on the retina, but It's an inverted one, like in this picture, which means an upside down image. So, the information is carried out from the optic nerve to the brain, and finally the brain will interpret the image in the proper way, which is upside. When it comes to the focusing of light, a lot of the focusing is carried out by the cornea, but the cornea is a fixed focus. The rest of the focusing is carried out by the lens of the eye. The lens allows us to focus on near or distant objects. To do this, the shape of the lens should be changed. The ability to change the shape of the lens to focus on near or distant objects is called accommodation. Now we'll see how the accommodation takes place. So when you look at the structure of the eye again, the lens is surrounded by a circular muscle called ciliary muscles. This is connected to the lens by fibers which are called suspensory ligaments. By contracting or relaxing the ciliary muscles, we can change the thickness of the lens. When the ciliary muscles contracts, the suspensory ligaments loosen. The lens is now thicker and refracts light rays more strongly. When the ciliary muscle relaxes, the suspensory ligaments are pulled tight. The lens is now pulled thin and only slightly refracts light rays. What happens when the eye focuses on a near object? Light from near objects needs to be focused a large amount. In this case, the ciliary muscles contracts. This causes the suspensory ligaments to loosen. Now the lens is thicker and refracts the light rays more strongly, and they are finally focused to a point on the retina. When we view an object far from the eye, the light from the distant object needs to be focused only a relatively small amount. So, in this case, the ciliary muscles relaxes and the suspensory ligaments are pulled tight. The lens is now pulled thin, so the light rays are only slightly refracted and the light rays are focused to the point on the retina. When you enter a dark room, the amount of light entering the eye is very low. This drop in light intensity is detected by light receptors in the retina, and these sends an electrical impulse to the brain. The brain then sends electrical impulses to the specific muscle in the iris. Then muscles contract, causing the pupil to become larger. This now allows more light to enter the eye. This is a reflex action, as it doesn't involve the conscious part of the brain. We can witness the opposite effect if we enter a very bright room or if we are exposed to bright light. In this case, the reflex causes the pupil to become smaller and it reduces the amount of light entering the eye, and it protects the eye from any damage. There are two groups of muscles, as you can see in this picture, which are involved in the iris to give this effect. There are circular muscles and radial muscles. Radial muscles are just like the spokes on a bike wheel. In bright light, the pupil has to be constrict. So, to help the pupil to do that, the circular muscles in the iris contracts and radial muscles relaxes. whereas in dim light, the circular muscles relaxes and radial muscles contracts to dilate the pupil. As we have come to an end of this lesson, we'll do some questions. The ability of the lens to change its shape to focus near and distant objects is called accommodation. The neuron is stimulated by a neurotransmitter to pass an electrical impulse along its length. First part. Draw a circle around the part of the neuron that is stimulated by the neurotransmitter. So, you can circle the dendrites near the cell body. The second part, the longest motor neuron in the human body passes electrical impulses from the base of the spinal cord to muscle in the big toe. This neuron can be up to 1.3 meters in length. An impulse passes along this neuron at a speed of 1.2 into 10 to the power 2 meters per second. Calculate the time taken in seconds for an impulse to pass along this neuron. So, how can we calculate the time? Speed is equal to length divided by time. So, length is given, the speed is given, you have to substitute the other parameters and find the time. So, 1.3 meters divided by 1.2 into 10 to the power 2 meters per second. Your answer should be 0.0108 seconds. So, hope you can do the questions in the slides, and please try to do the end chapter questions in page number 94 to 97 in your textbook. Now we'll summarize the lesson. We understand how organisms are able to respond to changes in their environment. We understand how a coordinated response requires a stimulus, a receptor and an effector. We discussed about the types of receptors, and we understood how nervous system controls responses. We discussed the structure of a typical neuron and the types of neurons, as well as the roles of neurotransmitters at synapses. Now we know the structure and function of a simple reflex arc, and we can describe the structure and function of the human eye as a receptor, and we understand the function of the human eye, and we discussed about iris reflex. So these are the references. Hope you learned something out of this lesson, and have a good day.